Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Doing all right. How are you doing?
I cannot complain. Um, Everything is okay, I guess. Um, Thank you for chatting with me again this morning. I really appreciate this, and I appreciate your willingness to come back again because we chatted earlier in the year. So thank you again. I would start by asking the same thing. Will you please tell us your name and share a little bit about yourself so we can go forward and
Sure. My name is Michele Okoh, and I'm a senior lecturing fellow of law at Duke. I'm in the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and I'm also teaching environmental justice readings course this term. I've been a practicing attorney for, let's see, I guess, 10 years now. I graduated from Duke Law back in 2009. So that's a little bit about my background, professionally, but I also have connections to Lafayette, Louisiana, and San Diego, California.
excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. When we talked last time, we covered a wide range of topics, and there are two I'd like to focus on this morning if we can. The first is, in defining what environmental justice means to people of color, not just the overall definition you can Google and find, but what does these things really mean to people that are marginalized or underserved in some way? And then the other question I'd like you to answer, if you can, is as an attorney, as a Black woman, as a person who is in this thing, how do we process this onslaught of death that's continuous? So we go back to enslaved times, and here we are in 2020, and we maybe the numbers of people being killed are smaller, but it's still the exact same process. So can you talk to both of those issues, please?
Sure. Well, environmental justice is really looking at how certain groups have to bear a disproportionate proportion of environmental burdens, but at the same time do not get to share in those benefits equally. So that, in a sense, turns towards environmental injustice. And that's what a lot of environmental justice literature kind of looks at, is environmental injustice. An important focus to me is realizing that, issues that we face with environmental injustice are achievable. And part of the significant aspect of environmental justice that I would like to focus on is how to actually achieve environmental justice. Now, you brought up communities. That's an important aspect of environmental justice. Environmental justice has to be community-led and a collaborative process. So really, it is a position of putting the community in the leadership role, where they are defining what their priorities are. You kind of mentioned the issue of race. Environmental justice is very much so tied into racial discrimination. In fact, it's sometimes called environmental racism. And it's essentially a lot of the problems that we face in this country is connected to our history of discrimination. And the thing is, we still face systemic racism. So that hasn't gone away.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem that we see with environmental justice, a lot of times, there are not situations where we at least have proof that there is overt racism. But a lot of times what we see when we're looking at problems related to environmental justice are supposedly racially neutral decisions. But even though they're supposed to be neutral, when you're setting them up in a world that is full of discrimination, that there's a history of discrimination that has controlled where people can live, what opportunities they have access to, the ultimate outcome is inequity.
Yep. So will you define what neutral decisions mean? So I hear that a lot, so a decision that is made that doesn't favor one group or the other. But tell us what a racially neutral or a neutral decision is.
So it's not based on race. So for example, a very common explanation is that it's on economics. So, and then sometimes also based on political willpower. So if there's a locally undesirable land use, we call those LULUs, right? So if you're an industry and you're trying to find a location for this LULU, a lot of times you're going to want to put it where it's going to be cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if you look at our history of discrimination, that is more likely to be in communities of color. Mm-hmm. But also, you're probably going to lean towards locating it also where you're going to have less resistance. Mm-hmm. So that's also where certain indicators such as, voter turnout matters, right? Mm-hmm. So those come into play. But I guess what is more disturbing is even beyond income, race is a greater determinant of where these LULUs will be located, even beyond income. So income is a determinant, but race is greater. Yeah. So that is kind of the extra as far as where these facilities are sited. Now, as far as racial neutrality, a lot of them, the justification is brought down to economics. And there you go into the history of prior discrimination. So if you already had a situations where you had redlining, like we do, where Black communities were limited in where they can raise communities, mm-hmm. and then you already have a history of other LULUs located there, mm-hmm. then it's a lot easier to put another one in addition to what was already there. So the idea is it's not based on race, but it may be based on, oh, well, this is cheaper. It may be based on, I'm not going to have much of a challenge here politically. And it can also be based on that there are previous, LULUs that are already in that community, right? So those factor in to turn what would be a racially neutral decision into one that is very much impactful based on race.
Yeah, that makes perfectly good sense. And so an example of a LULU would be a landfill.
Yes.
Maybe what do they call it? Fracturing. I don't remember exactly what the word is, but when they're
fracking, yes.
Fracking. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. All of those are examples of LULUs.
Yes, our CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, petrochemical plants. Those are all LULUs.
That makes perfectly good sense. And not having economic power to make that not happen in your neighborhood gives way to that happening in your neighborhood. So as you talked about redlining and other things that have happened, where, a lot of people think redlining has gone away, but it has not. It still exists today. A lot of people think that we have reached economic parity when in fact we have not, right? Because you still have places like Flint and parts of Mississippi and Alabama where there were all kinds of issues with economic outcomes that have negatively impacted Black communities and probably other communities of color, but still that's in fact there. So what can be done to begin to address this? So if you don't have the power, you don't have the economic fist to come to the game, how are these things changed? What are the things that we can do to change what's happening? And with a pandemic happening right here, we see that more Black and brown people are dying in the pandemic than other ethnicities. We see that there are more complications economically with the pandemic affecting businesses and being laid off, and these unemployment things and legislation in the Congress branch and things like that. So how do we undo this, or how do we fix this for communities that are economically challenged?
Mm-hmm. It will be a long road, and there's no simple fix. Unfortunately, legally, there's not a lot actually that's on our side, because a lot of provisions in the law that normally we would, want to turn towards really is looking at, overt racism
Mhm.
and having to actually demonstrate that. So the law can be helpful if you could actually document proof that there is, an underlying racial component. However, that is very challenging. However, the law is still a useful tool, and that's one of the things to remember. The law is a tool, but it should be a tool amongst many tools. So another tool would be direct action. So actually communities coming together, leading the effort. One thing that I think is very important as far as community action and actually, affecting change is to keep bringing attention to the issue. So a lot of times some of the problems can result because kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
So as far as where these facilities are located, the reason why a lot of times it's easy to forget about them is if you don't have to look at them. Well, these communities have to look at them.
Right.
So it's important that these communities remind us that they don't just disappear, that they have to deal with them being in their community and all the health impacts from them, all the economic impacts from them, and how it really can kind of disintegrate a community. So attention needs to continually be brought to that. So, and at the same time, one of the important things to remember about these communities is that they have agency. So they have the power to affect change. Now, from our roles in universities, where we come in, we have to realize that. And we have to treat them as though they do have agency. They do know what they're talking about, and that their concerns matter. So we need to, as universities and as professionals in general, to make partnerships with these communities, not define their agenda, but actually partner with them. Because universities have a certain level of privilege attached to them, and essentially they could act as a megaphone to support those community voices. But the thing that I'm stressing is it's still supposed to be community led, because I think a lot of the tendency is, and this is very concerning to me, is sometimes in those professional settings there'll be a mindset of the community is in academia are the subjects of my study. They're not the subjects of a study, they are people with their own priorities. Another thing is kind of coming from, an outside setting, but wanting to be a partner, is not to assume what those communities' priorities and agendas are. A lot of times, you'll see groups coming in and they'll take the perspective of, oh, well, this community would be fine with that because what they really care about is jobs.
Right.
You're presenting what you think is a priority to those communities. What you will find a lot of times with environmental justice communities is they do have their own connection to the environment. It may look different than what we see kind of in big green, like established environmental organizations, the traditional environmental organizations, but they have a connection to the environment that needs to be respected and supported. So we can't come in a sense with our own agenda and try to put it on a community and expect them to fall in line and support our agenda after it's already been set. So so a lot of what needs to happen is not business as usual. We need shifts in the power dynamic, shifts in how we respect people. So just because someone does not have, degrees after their name, does not mean they don't have anything relevant or important to say. Their issues matter. So a lot of it has to be the shift in that thinking. I think what we're seeing currently with the protests that are going on, I think that's kind of beneficial, because something that we've been ignoring, racial discrimination in this country, that we've been putting in the back burner, that we've been able to find a certain level of comfort in ignoring, we're not now being forced to look at directly in the face. So that is a positive thing. The concerning thing is, where do we go from here?
Yep.
We can't just forget about these issues. And we also have to realize, right, because I'm talking about communities, is that we have environmental justice, and that's my area of interest.
Mhm.
And, I have a tendency to approach it kind of from, a health equity lens, because currently I'm, in addition to the work that I'm doing, I'm also working on my MPH. Because I'm very concerned about health.
Right.
So I think a lot of times we have a tendency to want to look at it in a separate, discrete issue. One of the things about health when we're looking at environmental justice is it's not just a discrete, you know, chemical or a discrete Lulu that's going to be impacting these communities. We have to look at it as the quality of life for these communities. What opportunities do they have access to as well?
Mhm.
So whenever we're looking at health and environment, the environment is one component of health, but you have the physical and also the social that interact to create, disparities. And when you have those disparities, you have disparities in opportunity.
Mhm.
So I think it's also important to address that and connect it to justice issues as a whole, especially when you're dealing with, when you're working with communities, because like I said, their priorities matter. And if you're, for example, a lot of housing issues are also environmental justice issues.
Mhm.
But if you come in and you want to impose your lens on it, not getting, the overall priority, especially with COVID-19, right? Because you have, for example, housing in relation to um, be the ability to be able to pay rent,
Mhm.
but you also have housing as in the actual condition and quality. Are these homes actually healthy?
Right.
Well, if you're working with a community, you can't just say, oh, well, I don't care whether or not you're going to have a roof over your head. Let's just deal with the quality of the housing.
Right.
You've got to be willing to work with those priorities and address the bigger picture.
Yeah. And it's really ironic that you mentioned housing, because I think it's very important to note. Um, Earlier this year, one of the housing authority buildings was found to have carbon dioxide in the air and all of those things. But if we go back a little bit further back than that, so going back to redlining, right? So redlining was actually a law implemented by the federal government and then impacted to lower communities, right? And so separating the races, so Black people couldn't move into a white person's neighborhood. So you had these communities they built, which we call, well, at least I call projects, so you got, or some people call ghetto housing, but whatever it is, they built these all over the country to separate Blacks and whites. And they've never gone back and unwrong that action, not noted it was wrong, not compensate people for that. They just took it off the books. We no longer do that anymore. It's all great. While we know redlining still occurs, while we know that algorithms and automation is set against underserved communities, there's these pieces where you wonder, how do we still have housing projects in 2020? How do we think that people can live in a community where there's so much similarity between the people that live in that community that it's hard to understand why we're still doing this? So how do we undo that? What right does law have in this discussion, of correcting the redlining that happened for so long? And how do those communities who you said have agency bring about change for themselves? Because economically, that's your power, right? So, if you look at how power works, how much money do you have? Can you move to a new community? Can you live there? Whatever it is. So,
Yes, and that is a huge challenge. There's economic power, right? There's political power, but there's also social capital, right? And that the power of communities when they come together. And that's kind of that is a challenge to build. And it's kind of, and this kind of a catch 22 a lot of times when we look at moving, people from communities, because it also leads to kind of a breakdown of that community. I think one of the things as far as addressing it is acknowledging, because I mean it's easy for us to fall into this pattern, right? If we assume, okay, well, there we have a history of discrimination, and we have a history of slavery, and but that just, all the impacts of that just disappear. And that's kind of the approach that we have taken, which allows for the continuation of these patterns of, systemic discrimination that exists. So so acknowledging that, and actually having policy approaches that deals with actually addressing inequity, as opposed to assuming it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of an important piece that needs to be part of our plans. Definitely not just falling onto the idea that something is supposed to be neutral when you're applying it in an unequal system.
Right. That's perfect. So to go back to one of my earlier questions, so we are seeing, and I guess because technology has advanced it, we are seeing death visually, right? So we can hear the stories of lynching. There were newspaper articles and clippings, but this, what's happening and I'd say in America, it may be happening other places too, but what's happening here with the rate of Black men being killed by law enforcement agencies? And, it doesn't become a thing until somebody puts it out in some kind of social media or something like that. So most times, people, and I'm not sure if this is the case for you, but when I talk to my white colleagues, they're surprised that this has been happening, right? Like this is some new occurrence that just started with Mr. Floyd, whereas this has been going on since slavery and continuing to the day where Black people are killed willy-nilly, if you will, without any kind of recourse, without anything happening, So when you talk about the legal system, so I saw in the news yesterday that Mr. Jacobs' daughter is suing the police in Rochester and whatever it is, trying to get justice. And I think it's an assumption made that you won't get any criminal justice, but you might get economic justice as a result of this attack on her brother. So where does these deaths and the continuation of these deaths fall in the spectrum of environmental justice, and where does it fall in the law? So why is it that the police are almost siliconed wax, so it just slides off of them when things like this happen? Why isn't there processes that really make people accountable to this?
Yes, a challenge I would say is, so we also have a problem of implicit bias. And I think that sometimes comes into play when we see, you know, police violence. So if you listen to the characterization, you know, sometimes you have, super strength attributed to people, right? Are just intimidating, suspicious. And we see those come into play, right, in high stress environments, right? So, even for example, medical professionals, right? We see actually, we see differences in how black black women are treated for maternal health,
Right.
right? Based on, race, really. And the thing is, for their medical providers, they're making those assumptions. Now, so I think that plays a role. And when we look at implicit bias, that is more towards kind of the societal level, because we are taught certain things by society. We are taught certain things by the media.
Mhm.
And societal, those are, that comes into play with parents, that comes into play with your peers. But I do also think the media has a responsibility in how it depicts Black people.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem when the depictions that you see are that associated with crime, are associated with violence. So that is kind of an issue that exists there. I think that is part of the problem we see, but I do not think that is an excuse.
Yeah.
And one of the things that kind of works against, medical professionals in this area when it comes to implicit bias is that they have an assumption that they're going to be unbiased.
Right.
So part of that is to really put out there, no, you are going to be biased. And as hard as it is going to be for you to admit, you are going to make, honestly, even though it's unconscious bias, implicit bias, I think we need to call it what it is, racism, are going to impact how you respond to people. And that needs to be out in the open and addressed, but no excuses for it. And I think sometimes what we see is the reinforcement of, structural racism when it comes down to holding law enforcement accountable. Because if you're in a situation where you have judges and juries and attorneys who are looking and they are seeing that someone is suspicious or threatening, or that they would have been in fear for their lives, and they are not willing to deconstruct why, I think that is just going to perpetuate the problem. So I do think we need to be explicit about that. So I think that's part of the problem that exists.
And a part of that can be, so if we take the man in Rochester, who they put the bag over his head because he was spitting, he's outside naked. I mean, to me, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, so I'm not proclaiming to be a therapist or understand this, but something about that seems so blatantly obvious. This man had a break with reality somewhere. Something had happened to him. And the fact that he's spitting, everything they asked him to do, he complied with it, right? So, he got on the ground, they handcuffed him, and he's spitting. And only God knows why. It almost is that spitting and the naked almost go hand in hand. He's spitting because he's had this break, maybe. I don't know. I don't know what it is. But to, one, put a hood over his head, and then you've got him cuffed, he's on the ground, and you've got this hood, and now you're going to put your knee on his neck. I mean, I think that we would be wrong as a society to defund the police. I think what we should be doing is adding resources, that police officers are retrained frequently. So you have to do CLEs to maintain your lawyer, your license to practice law. Why aren't police officers required to do these trainings that help them understand people that do not look like them, or people who have mental health issues or economic issues, whatever it is? That's not a part of what we do for the police, that we don't make it so that the police have to have training and working with different groups, including social workers, psychologists, therapists, whoever it is that come in. So if you got a domestic violence issue, you bring a social worker, or you bring someone who specializes in domestic violence to this conversation. And on the other side, when someone is having a mental health issue, if someone had called the police and said there's a man naked on my street, the first thing I would think, you would call a mental health person versus the police. But it is what it is.
Actually, I definitely agree, and that's a problem. I also used to be a prosecutor, and I will say that sadly, the police are usually called to deal with mental health crises. And usually honestly, the outcome is not good. Sometimes it's the family members who reaches out to law enforcement to step in. But at that point, law enforcement is not trained to deal with mental health issues. And then you have this disturbing kind of power dynamics that kind of arises, where essentially they're trying to subdue someone. But when you're dealing with a mental health issue, that's definitely not going to work. Another issue that I've kind of seen with these cases is that, so whenever there's a stop, there's supposed to be reasonable articulable suspicion. Mm-hmm. What I've seen with a lot of law enforcement officers is they don't necessarily seem to know what that is. Right. It is not just, oh, that person's walking down the street and I don't know who he is, or he makes me feel uncomfortable. You really need to kind of pinpoint what is leading to suspicion. And a lot of times you'll see that as officers, essentially, they just feel uncomfortable. And not only that, as far as, response, you you can, right, say no to a law enforcement officer if you're not, if you're not seized. You can say, okay, well, I'm not going to answer your questions and move on. So, a lot of law enforcement officers, from what I've been seeing, don't necessarily seem to understand that.
Yeah.
So to understand that they need to understand what their limits are, and it's really disturbing that that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah. And unfortunately for us, I mean, like what you said about saying no to a police officer. So if you have someone who's been charged with a crime and been brought into the police department to be interrogated, they can lie to you, but you can't lie to them. So, they could tell you they have evidence that they don't have. They can tell you they've got your fingerprints or something, whatever. But to do that in reverse is a charge against you. So to be empowered to say no to a police officer before you've been arrested, so you've been pulled over for a broken taillight, or, the obvious question that has happened to me as I've been stopped by police officers, especially highway patrol: how fast were you going? How in the hell would I know? I'm not even looking at them at that speedometer. What do you mean, how fast have I been going? So the first thing they ask you, and then you think about this stuff. Well, you must know, because obviously you didn't ask the question you don't already know the answer to. So do I have a right to say I don't know, or I prefer not to answer, or I'm making my Fifth Amendment rights for non hurting myself, not to do anything to jeopardize my well-being? Where are those things in our society today? And I know we don't have very much time, so I will accept whatever you can say in this time.
Sure, yes. I mean, definitely, in those situations, no, you don't have to say anything that would be incriminating to you. In fact, that's a big mistake made by defendants. And I guess one thing to kind of stress is also, a lot of times people say, okay, well, if I don't want to answer the questions, then that means that I might have done it, and I'm innocent, so I just want to go ahead and answer. And it's like, no, you can say things that may be incriminating, even though you're innocent.
Right.
So the best thing you could do is keep your mouth shut, get an attorney.
Immediately.
Because I mean, even one little thing. For example, let's just say you supermarket that morning. You don't know that there's been a robbery, and you're just like, oh, I went to the supermarket. I mean, you've proof that you were at the supermarket this morning, even though you might not have had nothing to do with that. So that's not your job to prove that.
Right.
So I think it's very important that people understand that they don't have to incriminate themselves.
Yeah, and that's very important. And I think that somehow none of that overlaps into economic and environmental justice or injustice in these cases where people don't know what their rights are. People don't know what can and cannot happen to them. And so education in the legal system has to come, in some kind of fruition that looks like real justice to people who are brown and black.
Mhm.
Yep. Thank you
Definitely.
so much for chatting with me
Thank
today.
you.
I appreciate that very much. Stay safe and stay in touch.
Thank you. You too.
And I'll send you a link as soon as the video converts.
All right. Thank you.
Bye bye.